In this tutorial we'll look at Vector Paint function. Vector Paint is designed as a simple touch-up, restoration and matte painting tool. It doesn't have all the functions of something like Photoshop, but it does work in line with our processing stacks. Double-clicking reveals its own interface down here. So firstly, let's look at a couple of unique functions that allow it to work in our time space. For example, just go to the first frame and I'm going to draw a line. We can see that in fact it's straight away converted our line to a vector, and I can select that line, add keyframes and make animation because it's a vector line. Returning back, we can of course see that the paint has been applied to our shot, but in fact the paint is independent of the shot, which allows it to be connected to any other shot because the paint information is held within this effect. Another function of Vector Paint is the fact that it has an image channel and an alpha channel. Now at the moment this image doesn't have an alpha channel, so let's just pop back and make a quick one. So I'll just insert in here an RGB key and let's just make some adjustments to get a simple alpha channel. So now when I return to Paint, we can see that the alpha channel has been brought in. Using our view channels here, we can choose what to view. We can either view the image, or we can view the alpha channel and the image, or just the alpha channel. By default, the alpha channel color is blue, but in fact you can change that in the setup here. We'll come back to using the alpha channel later, because we can use Paint to modify it to improve our composites. I'll not go through every function here. Some are self-explanatory, others properly described in the manual, but essentially we choose to paint in this color set by this function or by picking from the screen. When we paint, we can choose whether applying to the image or to the alpha channel and the image or just the alpha channel, and we can choose the opacity of our paint. The brush size is here. We can switch between painting and selecting here, and we can see that this line is yellow, this line is purple. On this one, I previously inserted a keyframe. On this one, I didn't. So double-clicking a shape to select it, you can see that the keyframe identifier has come on, whereas it doesn't exist on the other shape. That means if I go on to other frames, we can see that only the shape with a keyframe still exists. Anything without a keyframe only exists on the frame on which it was painted. To add a keyframe, we can add a keyframe to all the shapes on the frame, or we can select individual shapes. Under Setup, we could also add autofix if we wanted to, so that as we make a change to a shape it automatically inserts a keyframe for us. We can select a shape by double clicking it. We can also lasso to select points. We can also select all the shapes on the current frame or shapes that appear in any frame. By selecting any individual point we can drag it around to make a shape change, or we can select a whole shape or any combination of points and use the transform option here, which then gives us a classic scale and move kind of box. Holding down Alt and dragging a corner will rotate. So I'm just going to select all the shapes, press delete, clear the screen for a second. We can also create shapes, in which case we can choose whether those shapes are closed or filled. So a box and fill. Once a shape is filled, we have a similar softness control to the actual shapes interface on each effect, so a size of width and an offset. There's also the function to add a drop shadow to a shape with attributes controlled here. Apart from shapes, we can also use the splines, a double click to end the shape as usual. We can choose whether it's closed and filled just like the other shapes. And we can choose the type of control point that makes the shape, and obviously insert and modify points. In fact, we can also generate text as a shape as well. Once a line has been created and a keyframe added, for any line that's selected, we can animate certain properties in a time editor. We can animate the brush size and color and a few other properties, One quite interesting one is the length of the shape. By changing the length of the shape, we can animate over time the drawing of the line or shape that we've created. A possible use for this can be to add a handwriting effect. So I've already created this piece of text, so I'm just going to add a vector paint, and I'm going to paint a single line that covers this entire piece of text. Should probably do it a bit more accurately than how I'm doing it, but you'll get the idea. Okay, so having created a single line, I'm just going to add a keyframe and then enter the time editor. So in the length, we'll animate it from 0 to 100%. So that will give us that. And then I'm just going to separate out the paint from the title, just so I've got the paint as its own entity and the title as a separate one, because then if I multiply the two together, then what we'll get is a writing on of our original typeface. Once a shape has been created and a keyframe added, we can also import 2D tracking data. So I'm just going to switch to a drag brush. I'm just going to do something fairly horrible to this guy. So if I add a keyframe, then obviously we can see that as we move either way, my paint stroke is always starting in the same place. So I'd like to track that to his face. So we'll just go back to the original shot, go to tracking, get a tracking point. Then the way we import tracking data into Paint is there's a parameter in the vector paint function here, position X and Y. And it's used just as a collection zone, just as a buffer really. So I'll apply my move into there. So now we can see we've got some movement going on. If I go back into the vector paint interface, nothing would have happened yet, because what I need to do is just ensure that a particular shape is selected. And then down here we have something called copy tracks. So that's now brought those tracking points to the shape and given me a keyframe to animate that shape accordingly. So we can do this differently for every single shape on the screen. Going back to using the alpha channel, there's a few different things we can do with it. As we saw, we created a rough alpha channel here. So actually when we're painting, we can tell Paint to obey the alpha channel as a stencil. So now as I'm painting, the alpha channel area is masked. But also I can paint directly on the alpha channel in order to make modifications to it. We made a rough matte by calculating the difference between this shot and this shot, and we ended up with a pretty rough looking alpha channel that has various holes in it just from where there's not enough difference between the foreground and the background. So this is an instant where we can use Paint to fill in any deficiencies in our matte. So if I add a vector paint here and enable alpha channel, we can see an overlay of the alpha channel over the image, and we can see the holes forming in our matte. So by applying to the alpha, we can use our paint to fill in the holes. Now sometimes it's easy to look at the matte like this, fully opaque over an image, but we can also, if we want to, mix it back to see it as a semi-transparent item. Or we could look at it on its own by switching off the image. Or in fact there's a third way as well, which is the vector paint can behave like a compositor, just like Comp 3D. So in fact if I give this a background to composite over, let's give ourselves a sand coloured background maybe. Now when I go back into the vector paint, if I choose composite mode, I can actually see my key being processed over the background. So I can now use this interactively to paint in the holes in my matte. Whether I'm adding to my matte or taking from my matte is simply dependent on the level here. If I bring the level down to 0, then I'm now removing from the matte. There's also another way we can use vector paint in a compositing way as well. In this example, we've been adding or removing from an existing matte. Or of course we could draw a matte from scratch using the shapes or just by painting. But we also have functions to reveal between two inputs. And so I have an example from a recent project of mine that we can look at. The challenge for me here was that this road has been completely replaced. And so I needed to restore the athlete back over the top. So in fact what I started with was this, because the athlete couldn't run on the icy February London road with his blades. So the production team put down this red carpet for him to run on. So having found a bit of road texture and then cut the cars back over and then added all the various levels of light to make the road surface believable as a wet surface, I then got to the point of having to restore the blades back over my road for the final touches. So let's look at that section there, because this is where I used vector paint. So here what I have is I've essentially got two inputs to the vector paint. I've got my composite so far without the legs, and then I've got the original shot, with the only modification being that I'm just adding a color corrector just to kill off that red, just so any spill I get isn't bright red. So then what takes place in the vector paint is I'm using the restore brush to paint back in his legs over the original background. So if I just delete off this frame, just to see what we start with. So initially we have no leg, no blade in there. If I go to paint on my image channel and then choose reveal from background, we can see that as I paint, I'm actually restoring from the original. So because the shape that I needed to composite from changed so radically from frame to frame, and it had so much motion blur, and as you can see, so much effect from lens flare and so on, rather than draw a shape to cut out this object, I opted instead to use the restore brush. The reason is that shapes are good if you're trying to follow a consistent object through the frame, but the motion blur and the shape of the legs changed so radically on here that a shape drawn on one frame didn't really mean much on the next. So instead, I just go between revealing enough of the background to be able to see where I'm painting, and then going to reveal foreground, and then I can just get in nice and accurately and just restore in just the bit that I want and choose the level of motion blur, because obviously the blur is blurring against that red carpet. So it allows me to just bring in the amount of frame that I want with the softness that I want. I can also use this function here, mix frames, which allows me to mix up and down between the two inputs so that I can see what I'm painting from the background. Although actually my method on this, as you saw, was actually just to paint a big area back in and then nick it back out by alternating between reveal background and reveal foreground. The vector paint also has some interesting tools for restoration by combining the functions of painting with the optical flow functions of Mistika. So if I just go to a different example, in this shot we had a problem with a high-speed bird here flying through on a time-lapse shot, so I just needed to get rid of this. So using vector paint again, as we can see, the bird is going over quite a complex background because the clouds are constantly changing, there's grain and so on. Now I could try to use clone to get rid of this, in which case I could use the clone foreground brush, and wherever I click Alt will be where I'm painting from. So as I draw, it's copying that bit of the cloud. But as you can see my painting because this bit of the cloud is different to that bit. So in some situations a clone will work, but in this it's going to be a little bit more difficult just because of the way the clouds are constantly evolving in their time-lapse way. So instead we have this function, repair with virtual frame. What happens now is that I'm revealing from another frame, just like I was with the legs a second ago, except rather than being a different input, it's a virtual input creating using its optical flow technology. And it's creating a virtual frame between the frame before the one I'm painting on and the frame after. So the result is that because this bird is moving between frames, it can basically give me what that background would be without the bird there by comparing the frames on either side. And then from that comparison, making a frame from scratch. So as you can see, even though I'm painting over grain and evolving clouds, what I'm getting is a pretty invisible join. So dragging through here, we can see where I started to paint, the bird will appear, and then it disappears without seeing any joins in my paint. So that pretty much covers vector paint. Have a play around with the different brushes and have a look in the manual for any functions that I didn't directly cover.